Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Lavinka. I'm here with MedPage today. Today we're going to be discussing fluoride and fluoridation in water. I'm here with Rivka Green, a doctoral student in clinical developmental neuropsychology, that's a mouthful, at York University in Canada. And today we're going to be discussing her study published in JAMA Pediatrics in August, titled Association Between Maternal Fluoride Exposure During Pregnancy and IQ Scores in Offspring in Canada. How are you doing, Rivka?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Good. Thanks for doing our Facebook Live.
Yeah.
This was an interesting study, one that has gotten substantial attention since it was published. It was published accompanied by an editor's note as well from JAMA Pediatrics editor. So I wanted to start maybe just by having you, first I wanted to invite the audience to post any comments or questions that they have for you on our Facebook Live page, and we'll be sure to periodically check on those and ask them throughout. But my first question for you, I wanted to just maybe have you sort of outline what the current U.S. recommendations are for fluoridation in water, and what the proposed benefit is, and sort of just detail, the history of this fluoridation in the U.S.
Yeah. So in both Canada and the U.S., the current recommendation for fluoride in water is 0.7 milligrams per liter. And this value is considered the optimal level for protecting against dental decay, but while also minimizing the risk of dental fluorosis, which would be too much fluoride exposure in early tooth development. And the proposed benefit is that we add fluoride to the water to protect against dental decay.
Right. And something that you noted in the study that I thought was interesting, that's different than in North America than it is in Europe, for example.
Yeah. So in Europe, about 2 to 3% receive fluoridated water, whereas in North America and the States, upwards of 80% receive fluoridated water, and in Canada, about 1/3.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about, when and why this practice started to be put into question? So I know it's a little bit controversial, and there's some debate about whether water should be fluoridized. What prior evidence was there in support of either side of this debate?
It's a very interesting history, and it's something that happens serendipitously, that a dentist observes these brown spots, discoloration in children's teeth. But he noticed that these teeth were also more resistant to dental decay. And later, researchers realized that it was the fluoride, naturally occurring levels of fluoride in the water, that were discoloring the teeth, which we today call dental fluorosis, but also were providing a therapeutic effect against dental decay. So later, in around the 50s, they started adding fluoride into the water to protect against dental cavities, and they saw therapeutic results from the fluoride in the water. And at this point, many different organizations endorsed water fluoridation. The CDC called it one of the greatest achievements in the 21st century, and it was widely accepted. But however, since it's been added, there have been fierce debates regarding its safety. And it's a contentious issue with people on both sides. The dental community majority support the practice, and of course, it's their job to protect against teeth. But there are public health groups and others that are worried about potential risks. These include safety risks to vulnerable populations like pregnant women, which is what we studied, and also other safety risks.
Okay. And were there any prior research? Was there any prior research sort of similar to your study looking at this? I know there was maybe one in Mexico in 2017.
Yeah.
That's kind of similar.
At the beginning, when fluoridation was first instituted in the 1950s, there were no studies specifically on pregnant women, and there were very few studies on safety studies that would be typical to what we see in a North America population. Prior to 2017, there were no pregnancy studies looking at safety. A study that was published, as you mentioned, from the Element Group in 2017, they found an association between higher levels of maternal urinary fluoride concentration and lower IQ scores. And it was a very similar design to our study.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But those are sort of sparse. I know that your study is sort of, monumental in this sense that even though there might be a few similar studies previously, the other ones, similar studies have been sort of small or.
It's definitely the biggest pregnancy cohort for this question. It's also the first one to look at levels found in a North American samples. And as well in Mexico, the salt is fluoridated there, whereas opposed to our study, water is fluoridated. So it's the first study looking at a pregnancy cohort that is receiving community water fluoridation with this optimal level of 0.7.
Okay, great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your study in particular? So, what were your main findings here? And importantly, how was the study conducted? How was fluoride measured? And how was the neurodevelopmental outcomes measured?
Mm-hmm. So we used a cohort called the Maternal Infant Research on Environmental Chemicals, MIRIC, which we refer to it as cohort. And this is a large pregnancy cohort that recruited about 2,000 women between the years of 2008 to 2012 from across Canada. So 10 cities across Canada, some of which added fluoride to the water, some of which did not. And our first study was we collected urine samples from all 3 trimesters of pregnancy for each woman that provided a urinary measure. And we averaged those values and we looked at the values in their urine, and we saw that women who lived in a fluoridated community had about 2 times higher fluoride in their urine as compared to women who didn't. And then next, we looked at these children. Some of the 6 out of the 10 cities were invited to participate in the IQ testing, about 600 children, and we looked at the association between prenatal fluoride and IQ in these children. We measured prenatal fluoride using 3 different measures. One was the urinary fluoride concentration, which I described from 3 trimesters. The second was fluoride intake. So women were asked at 2 time points how many cups of water or tea or coffee they drink. These were averaged. And then we also looked at the level of fluoride that they received in their water matched to their postal code over the 9 months of pregnancy. So it was an objective measure of how much water they would be receiving from their water source multiplied by how many cups they reported consuming. So that was fluoride intake. We also looked at our third measure was water fluoride concentration. So just what value did they receive in their water fluoride over their 9 months of pregnancy averaged.
Okay.
And so what did we find?
Yeah.
We found that these 3 markers of prenatal fluoride exposure were associated with lower IQ scores. For maternal urinary fluoride, we found a decrement for boys only, and for our water based measurements, we found a decrement of IQ in both boys and girls.
Okay. Right, and that's sort of the monumental finding here. What was maybe surprising to a lot of people who saw this.
Yeah, and it was surprising to us as well. When we went into this, many of us, all of us were, we thought that fluoride was, a safe and beneficial way to protect against cavities, and it wasn't something that we went in looking for, and we were surprised by the results for sure.
Yeah, speaking to sort of the importance of the findings, what potential impact could this have, if fluoride is confirmed in future research, and sort of these findings are confirmed in future research to be a neurotoxin?
Yeah, and we want to say that no one study is definitive, and
right.
This isn't a standalone study in the sense that there have been many studies looking at potential risks of fluoride, and specifically to vulnerable populations, as we've seen before. But our study does indicate that fluoride found in levels of women who are living with community water fluoridation may not be safe for fetal development. And time will tell whether this study, nested with studies that are already out there or future studies, will help to inform policy about fluoridation. And it will be up to the public health scientists and policymakers to weigh the benefits and the risks as new evidence is emerging.
Right. Was it hard to get this study published? I mean, I can imagine that you would predict that, it would make headlines, to say the least. So, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, well, just to get the study funded was difficult. We received rounds and rounds of reviews on our funding applications. Next, writing up the results, we had several reviewers from health experts in the field even before we submitted to journals, many of which really helped to enhance our manuscript. We have a diverse group of authors on our paper: dentists, pediatricians, epidemiologists, psychologists. So all of our perspective went into account. We really wanted to publish in a medical journal, and we applied to many journals before finding the right fit, some of which said it was a low priority, some didn't send it for review. And we want to thank JAMA Pediatrics for considering a controversial paper. We think their editorial and their podcast really added, and we went through several rounds of reviews at JAMA Pediatrics by the editors, by the reviewers, and overall we think that their feedback really enhanced our work and helped us with this process.
Certainly, yeah. And at least it sort of gets the dialogue going, and maybe perhaps calls for future research at the very least.
Definitely, that's definitely something that we're calling for.
Mm-hmm. So going back to sort of these findings here, I'm curious, why do you think there was this sex difference between boys and girls?
Yeah, so actually we proposed from the outset to look at an interaction by sex. We wrote this on our funding application and our ethics application, and this is because of the one study that looked at prenatal exposure in rats. They found that male rats were more susceptible prenatally and female rats postnatally. We also, the National Toxicology Program and the National Research Council, both who did big reviews on this topic, called specifically for studies of fluoride exposure looking at sex differences because so much was lacking. So we weren't surprised to see a result only affecting boys. Boys are more at risk for things like for neurodevelopmental outcomes, but also for neurotoxic impacts to lead, air pollution, BPA. We see it in the developmental neurotoxicology literature all the time, and it's now become standard practice to test for sex differences because of all the different findings we're seeing. I think something that a lot of people are confused about is they ask, why do we see for boys for the urine predictor, but then we saw it across boys and girls for our other predictors? And we can speculate that perhaps maternal urinary fluoride is capturing exposure during the prenatal period, as that was our best measure of prenatal exposure, whereas our water fluoride measures represent a chronic cumulative dose that does begin prenatally, but children are exposed to throughout early life, especially infants, let's say, fed formula with fluoridated water. So perhaps that measure is capturing a postnatal effect, which is affecting both boys and girls. And this would be consistent with literature suggesting fluoride postnatally to be predictive of boys and girls.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about sort of those different measures and why there was that difference there as well. That sort of touches on a comment that was actually left on the Facebook Live promo page that I wanted to ask about. It's from Karen Spinker, and she says, I understand that there are many other types of studies, including animal models, that have also found fluoride affects learning. So when you were talking about sort of the mouse studies with the sex differences, I wanted to ask more about. She said, can you describe some of those types of studies and how they align with yours?
Yeah. So the animal literature is quite mixed. It's varied. It could depend on doses and the type of species and the different outcomes. But animal studies have suggested that fluoride exposure can alter behavior and affect learning and memory. There was a comprehensive review by the National Toxicology Program in 2016, and they found the strongest evidence of fluoride exposure for adults, not the developmental literature like we see in human studies. But there have been studies of prenatal exposure to fluoride in rodents that show that there are differences in brain tissue, suggesting that fluoride can be toxic to the fetal development.
Right. So obviously that would sort of tip you off to, study this in humans.
Yeah. But the verdict is still out there for animal literature, as there's many different studies that looked at different species and looked at different times and different amounts. So more research is definitely needed there.
Okay. So in your study, did you find, or do you think that there might be some developmental domains that are more or less affected by fluoride exposure?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question, because we're just now looking across the element cohort and the myric cohort of the two different domains of intelligence. There's verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence, which we call performance intelligence sometimes. And verbal intelligence is more loaded by factors like quality of the home environment and enrichment at home from parents and things like that, whereas performance intelligence is like visual spatial functioning, nonverbal reasoning, like fluid reasoning. And both of our cohorts have found the effect to be primarily with performance IQ. So these are cognitive domains, like I mentioned, visual spatial analysis. So it could be that fluoride exposure is more associated with those types of IQ measures, like nonverbal reasoning as opposed to verbal.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about and sort of speculate why that might be.
Yeah, well, it is consistent with animal literature in the sense that they found alterations in those behaviors as well, in those domains as well. We will be looking, like I said, across both cohorts, with the Mexican cohort and the Canadian cohort, to see if the effect is primarily with the performance IQ.
Okay, interesting. And was there a certain threshold by which fluoride exposure, at or above or a certain level was found harmful, but below it was non-significant, or was this sort of a linear association?
Mm-hmm. We actually didn't find evidence of a safe threshold. We looked at spline, so we put knots in our data and looked at different exposure, different ranges of exposure, and we did not find that they significantly differed from the overall linear trends. So we did not find evidence for a safe level of exposure, and we hope that our research will help to inform that in policy, finding a safe level as evidence continues to evolve.
Okay, that's interesting as well. I have another question that was posted previously on our Facebook Live from Stephen Bornfeld, and it's more of a comment, but I think the point that he brought up was, what other sources of fluoride might women in the study have been taking in? And were you able to account for that in the study?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that our measures were designed to look at fluoride from all sources. Maternal urinary fluoride captures fluoride from any source, and that's why we did not look at IQ differences by group, as some people have suggested, looking at non-fluoridated versus fluoridated. That was not our design. Not even all women could be categorized into that if they didn't report drinking tap water. So we did look at our primary source from all sources, and other sources could include things like tea, which we were able to account for, as well as, let's say, dental products, or from pesticides or other fluoride sources in the diet. Our fluoride intake variable was able to account for, as I mentioned, tea as well as water. And it is important to note that fluoride from water accounts for about 60 to 80% of total intake for adults. So looking at water first as the major source would make sense. Of course, future research should look at fluoride from all sources, but we were lucky to have exact measurements of fluoride from the tap water.
Okay. It looks like we've got a couple of questions actually posted on Facebook as well. So this one's from Vincent De Gregorio, and he wants to ask, first of all, how he's interested in the IQ drop specifically, how it's measured, and could neonatal brain effects and IQ drops have latent effects that appear in older age? And also, a third part to his question, is there a follow-up study planned?
Oh, great questions. I see some comments popping up, so they're just trying to erase so it's not distracting, but
Yeah.
but it's still there. So the first question was, how is IQ measured? So, oh, it's gone. IQ is measured by the WIPC, which is a Wechsler preschool standardized measure. It has very good internal reliability. We had psychometrists that were trained and blinded and were able to do these standardized assessments. Was there a second part to that, to the IQ?
Are there latent effects that could develop?
I think that, there have been some studies, one that I'm aware of, looking at, later on dementia effects. But I think research is still very early on that. And our study specifically looked at early life exposure. My training is in developmental psychology, so something I'm interested in is early life. But I think that will be important to look at in the future, definitely. And the last part was next steps. And something came up. Next steps, definitely we're looking at other windows of susceptibility. We have currently a paper that has just been accepted on formula, on infants fed formula with fluoridated tap water, maybe at a high risk of fluoride exposure. We're also interested in other ways to measure prenatal fluoride, and we just received a grant from NIHS to look at fluoride in tooth dentin. And this will be able to show us that fluoride crosses the placenta and enters fetal tissue because the tooth captures exposures appearing prenatally and postnatally. So we're very excited about that. We'll be able to look at other things like thyroid as well, which is awesome. What's happening more recent is that we were invited to submit a letter in response to several letters to the editor, to JAMA, of several critiques on our work. So we're working on addressing the critiques, some of which have come up today, and hoping to clear up some things that might not have been clear beforehand.
Cool. Yeah, this is an ongoing process, obviously.
Definitely.
One and done study.
Early on still, definitely we recognize that this is the first of hopefully several, and replication is always very important.
Right. So sort of speaking to that, what factors did you control for in your study that sort of strengthened the robustness of these findings? And then on the other hand, what factors were you unable to control for that might be potentially confounding the findings?
Yeah, and this question comes up a lot. And we are really fortunate to have access to this cohort, which is such a rich set of covariates. For this type of research, we really had a lot to control for. We could control for socioeconomic status and other characteristics of the parents. Several other neurotoxicants like lead, mercury, perfluorinated compounds. We could control for many things that occur after birth and before the assessment, like duration of breastfeeding and quality of the home environment, which is a really great measure because that captures how much face time are they experiencing with parents, and quality, the enrichment, how many books are they reading. So that measure captures a lot. We even measured things like parental stress after birth and parental depression. So we had a really strong list of covariates. Something that came up is that we didn't have maternal or paternal IQ, and maternal and paternal IQ can be associated with child IQ. We noted that as a limitation, but we did have maternal education, paternal education, and other demographics that are correlated with IQ that could serve as a proxy.
Okay. Right. The other characteristics that you had was, for example, like maternal education, college or high school education, things like that.
Yeah. And what was interesting about our sample that hopefully we'll be able to describe in an upcoming paper is that women who lived in fluoridated communities actually had significantly higher education and other factors. They're more likely to be married. And so we are seeing that fluoride was associated with non-significantly with higher levels of verbal IQ, which makes sense because the women who are living in these fluoridated communities had significantly higher factors that load onto verbal IQ. So after controlling for those covariates, the effect wipes out. But the trends that we're seeing is that in fluoridated communities, the mothers have more of these factors, which can also would probably bias our results towards the null,
right.
Which is interesting to note.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah. And how do you think the results might have changed? This is something you were bringing up just a few minutes ago, but if you had been able to, how do you think the results might have changed if you had been able to account for postnatal fluoride exposure?
Mm-hmm.
So you measured IQ when the kids were 3 or 4, right? So
yeah, for sure.
They had they'd already started brushing their teeth with toothpaste, for example.
Yeah, and you know, as I mentioned, developmental psychologists, we definitely recognize that the brain continues to develop postnatally, of course, and also that fluoride exposure will continue into the early years. Like you mentioned, it could come from swallowing toothpaste. It could also come from fluoridated water being used to prepare formula. And the first step of our study and what we applied to do was to look at whether there was an association with prenatal exposure. And then our ongoing work is looking at critical periods. This study wasn't designed to look at specific windows of vulnerability, but definitely follow-up research that has all that data. And we're fortunate to have child's urinary fluoride values and other values that we will be looking specifically at different windows of exposure.
Okay, great. And that's in another study that you'll be
doing? Yeah, that's in an upcoming work. I can say that we are still seeing the effect on boys from maternal urinary fluoride. That effect still seems to be there. So it is likely that this prenatal effect is something that will remain. It is hard to tease out the water fluoride variable because it's the same dose that is occurring throughout life, but definitely our upcoming work on tooth dentin will be able to address these limitations of different windows of susceptibility.
Great. Well, I'd like to just pause to invite the audience again to ask any questions you have for us on the Facebook comments. We'll be sure to keep checking them. We have one that was posted on the promo as well. This is from Randy Johnson. And he asks, how strong is the association in your study between IQ and exposure to fluoride in the two groups? So, you know, were there significant outliers in boys and girls that might be driving these findings?
I want to say, I think I mentioned this before, but we never intended to look at differences by groups. We weren't looking at fluoridated versus non-fluoridated. To put this into context, a woman, let's say living in Vancouver where water is not fluoridated, could drink a lot of tea and have the same value in her urine as somebody who's living in Toronto and drinking bottled water. So it would never make sense to look at it by groups, and that's why we looked at a continuous level of exposure, both maternal urinary fluoride intake, all in a continuous metric, and we never intended nor wanted to look at between group differences. We're interested in fluoride from all sources. In terms of outliers, we did test for potential outliers using tests of leverage and tests of if they were influential. Our QQ is a little technical, but our QQ plots did not reveal any influential outliers. And some outliers like we had can be considered good leverage points. And regardless of that, we omitted these two outliers in our supplemental analysis to show that the effect still remains without these outliers. And our plots and our regression diagnostics didn't show any other potential outliers.
Okay. He asked one follow-up that I wanted to cover as well, sort of getting into the statistics a little bit more, but I think you'll be able to answer. So he says, given the significant scatter in the two figure 3 graphs referring to the paper, what is the correlation coefficient, the R value for the regression lines?
Yeah. We never intended to purposely omit the R-squared. It's on my thesis, which is published on Space. The R-squared is there. It never was specifically left out. It just, based on the journal, what they want to put in is what was put in. The R-squared for maternal urinary fluoride for boys explained 5% of the variance. That was the semi-partial R-squared over and above other covariates. To put 5% into context, and you consider all the factors that go into explaining IQ, as we mentioned with the covariates, this is quite a big number. It's actually the same number we see in the lead IQ studies, and it's actually the same number that we see in some genetic studies, that genetics explain 5% of the variance. So to be able to explain 5% of IQ variance is a lot, and that was what was shown in that first graph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually, what sort of parallels you see between this debate over water fluoridization and lead, for example?
Yeah. And, we do see some parallels, and especially one of our co-authors who we're so fortunate to have, Bruce Lanphier, has been a giant in the lead literature. So he also points out, I want to say, though, from the outset that fluoride does serve a beneficial effect, but lead does not. So that from the beginning, that's a difference. But 10 years ago, Bruce speaks about his experience, that he experienced many of the same criticisms about low-level lead toxicity, like bias and unmeasured confounding, and that these effects were too subtle. And often, Dr. Needleman was big in this field, and his work was dismissed by colleagues, many of which weren't familiar with the childhood lead literature, but still provided comments. I mean, we're seeing that a lot, that people are providing expert comments where it's clear they haven't read the paper in depth because they're getting facts wrong, or they're not experienced with the overarching literature, and they're still willing to provide these quick comments. And in terms of lead, since that time, many other researchers like Bruce, our co-investigator, were able to replicate Dr. Needleman's early lead findings. And it's an interesting story because we think about like how much evidence we need to act and to inform policy. And you asked about, is this going to tip the debate? But it was only one study in 1991 that allowed the CDC to lower it from 25 micrograms per deciliter in lead to 10. But then to get the CDC to say there's no safe level of lead, they needed 24 studies. So we're now seeing that public health agencies require a lot more evidence to look at these exposures. So it's interesting to see some parallels between low-level lead toxicity and also low-level fluoride exposures.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think that's sort of an obvious parallel that some people have drawn, just sort of about that initial debate, at least, if not other things. We have another question from the audience. It's from Christine Thorne. She's curious how you quantify the fluoride intake of pregnant women and whether you tested the urine during the whole pregnancy. So you did the urinary test 3 times, correct?
Yeah, so urine, as many studies rely on one spot sample. Our study was rigorous in the sense we took 3 spot samples and only retained women who could provide all 3 samples, and we averaged those. We also could adjust for urinary dilution by both specific gravity and creatinine, and we looked at both those adjustments, and the results held. So it was a very strong measure of maternal urinary fluoride, and that wasn't as limited to things that spot samples are limited to. Of course, with every measure, there are limitations. It can't account for, let's say, an immediate high dose of fluoride. That would show up, but we could account for this by having multiple samples. But we did have 3 measures because each one could be limited by have some of its own limitations. But fluoride intake, our measure, as I mentioned, was we used water fluoride concentrations that were matched exactly to the woman's postal code that serviced each woman's house. We took daily, we obtained from these water treatment plants, we asked them for daily measurements of fluoride. They sent us tons and tons of Excel files. We looked at each trimester to get the geometric mean of each trimester. Then we looked at all the means combined to assign a value to each woman. In terms of their self-report of cup strength, they answered at 2 time points, and the consistency between the 2 time points was high, and we were able to average those time points as well and then multiply it by the water fluoride concentration. We consider this also to be a strong measure. Of course, self-report is always can be limited by bias, but what we see in epidemiologic research that there are many self-report measures, and you take them with their limitations, but we consider that you're able to learn a lot from them.
Mm-hmm. And specifically with the measure of the urine concentration, what about the sort of half-life of fluoride? Like, is it possible that that was affecting the concentrations or the measurements?
Definitely, that's a limitation with urinary measures. The half-life of fluoride is about 6 hours, so the exposure can be gone quickly. That's why we did have all 3 trimesters. So if one was limited by an exposure, we're able to get 3 different time points and average them out, which we consider to be stronger than a single spot sample.
Okay.
We are fortunate that our upcoming study will be looking at the tooth dentin, which won't be as limited by some of the limitations with urinary concentrations.
Right. And how old will the children be in that future study that you're going to look at, follow them up with?
Yeah, so the children right now are between 9 to 12. In that study, we still will be looking at the IQ testing that occurred when the kids were 3 to 4. So the fluoride measurements in the tooth happened before the IQ testing at 3 to 4. But there are follow-up studies where follow-up assessments. We're really glad to be using this cohort. The kids are being seen now from different assessments, and we hope to use those as well.
Great. Yeah, Randy Johnson had another question about this cohort. He asked if it was this group of kids was pre-registered with the MyRic program, and if this data was specifically collected with the intent of assessing a possible correlation between fluoride exposure and IQ, or on the other hand, was it selected after data collection, sort of post?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a prospective cohort that was originally designed to look at early life exposure to chemicals, various early life exposure to chemicals, not prescriptively defined ahead of time. And the researchers that use this cohort use archived urine samples or other biomarkers to look at exposure to various chemicals and various health endpoints. We did not use a subsample. We looked at every single woman who provided a urinary concentration. We analyzed their urine for fluoride, and we used all valid children who completed the IQ testing. So the reason there's only 600 children is because only 6 out of the 10 cities, due to various constraints, were invited to participate in the follow-up study. So all the data that was available from this overarching prospective cohort was used in our study.
Okay, great. That clears it up. Let's see. We have one more question from Johnny Johnson. He says, would you recommend pregnant mothers to drink fluoridated water or not? Do you think that the study provides sufficient evidence for that?
Yeah, and it's a very important question. Like I mentioned, our study did not specifically look at fluoridated water. We didn't look at between groups. Based on the findings in our study, combined with previous existing literature and 2 other pregnancy cohorts, we do recommend that to apply the precautionary principle here, which states that if you aren't sure of whether there is a risk, to err on the side of caution, and that is to reduce fluoride intake during pregnancy. The way women can reduce their fluoride intake, there's various different ways that women can reduce their intake. They can reduce it by choosing not to drink fluoridated water or choosing to limit tea or other fluoridated products. I think it's also important to note that there's no benefit to the fetus to have fluoride. Fluoride works predominantly after tooth eruption. So we have to consider that while there is no benefit for the fetus, there is a potential risk. And women can protect their teeth during pregnancy by other ways, such as oral care, like brushing your teeth, as well as limiting sugar. So there are other ways as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point to make about, the weighing the potential harms and benefits.
Yes.
even
as
in the
it applies to the fetus. Yeah.
Right. So if you could, taking all this into account, sort of, looking at the study in retrospect, and perhaps, in light of some of the comments that you received about it, if you could do the study differently, what would you do differently?
Yeah. I think a better question could be maybe how to improve certain limitations of our study, given the information and the measures that we had. I think we did the best that we could, and I think we did a great job. I think a way to improve the study is to look at a biomarker that is more sensitive to fetal exposure, like the tooth dentin, so we can really capture prenatal versus postnatal and really ensure that fluoride is entering fetal tissue. So that would be a way to improve the study. We do think that the study for sure needs to be replicated in other populations as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's sort of all the questions I had for you, but I'd like to invite the audience one last time to leave any comments that you have for Rivka here. But in the meantime, Rivka, did you have any closing comments that you wanted to bring up about the study or future directions before we end this Facebook Live?
Yeah, I think those were great questions, and I'm just thinking about other things. We did get a lot of questions about what the impact of, let's say, 4 IQ points or things like that. And I just want to put the 1 milligram per liter into context, because some people thought that value didn't represent our population. And if you think about 1 milligram per liter, which is what we're seeing with the IQ effect of 4.5 points for boys, it's the 86th percentile for a woman living in a fluoridated region. So what that means is that 14% of women in a fluoridated region have a value of 1 milligram per liter or higher. So this translates, if you look at the amount of births per year, this translates to tens of thousands of Canadians per year and hundreds of thousands of Americans per year. So the 1 milligram per liter is not something that's out of that you would be out of possibility. And in terms of fluoride intake, what we're seeing is the 1 milligram of fluoride per day with the decrement of 3.6 points in both boys and girls. And a woman who's receiving optimally fluoridated water, like 0.7, if she drinks 5 cups of either water or water-based beverage like coffee or tea, then she's hitting the 1 milligram a day just from drinking water. So just to put those values, those IQ losses into context, they're not, that's the way we interpreted it.
Right, yeah, that definitely helps, just exactly as you said, put it in context. We did have one more question come in while you were speaking from Karen Spencer, and she says, please speak to the biological plausibility of fluoride causing subtle brain damage that could manifest as a loss of IQ or another learning disability.
Yeah, it just popped up for me. And that's such a great question, and it's something that I thought about a lot while defending this was my master's thesis and defending my master's thesis and speaking about this. We know at high levels how fluoride affects the brain from studies that are done on aborted fetuses and looking at that fetal tissue in areas with endemic fluorosis. So we know at high levels. In terms of low levels, we still don't know the exact mechanisms. We can speculate that it might be affecting in the endocrine system, on the thyroid system, that if it's recent studies have shown an association between fluoride and thyroid hormones. So if it is affecting even subclinical hypothyroidism, that could be having effects on IQ. But that's still something that's definitely needs to be researched further.
Great. Yeah, the study proposed a lot of questions, and I think it was definitely thought-provoking. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have for you, Rivka, but thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for joining us as well. I'd like to just invite any commenters. You can still leave some questions on this post, and we can consult with Rivka and get back to you to answer them after the fact, after our live stream is over. But thanks again, Rivka. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course.